Hello, my name is Bruce, and I'm a physician retired from the practice of pathology, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk to you about the health effects of climate change. There's a handout that goes with my talk, and it should be on the website of CypherCon. Has anyone encountered it? Okay, well, Mike Getzman told me that my handout is available to everyone, and you should check it out because it has all the references. I'm not going to show you all the references in my talk, and also the handout might be better than the talk. Another thing I have is I have these wallet cards. They have what I think are the best 5 websites for scientific information about climate change. I just wonder if I could pass it down to you and you could just they're especially good if you know teenagers that are interested in computers. Anyway, the websites on there will tell you everything there is to know about climate change. Okay. Climate change is probably the most important event in your life if you are less than 30 years old. And climate change is going to be the biggest medical problem of this century. By 2050, it's estimated that more people will die from climate change than will die from heart disease or cancer or diabetes. You can see this statement that was made by the Lancet Commission on Climate Change. Probably, have some of you heard of the medical journal, The Lancet? Well, anyway, The Lancet is a British medical journal, and occasionally you hear about them in the news. And in 2014, they put together a commission to study the health aspects of climate change. And this quotation was from the first report by the Lancet Commission. And on my handout, you'll see the most recent, the 2021 report by the Lancet Commission. And it gives you probably the single best summary of health and climate that you can find. Now the thing is, it doesn't have to be this way. We can actually change the world, and we have to, by eliminating the combustion of fossil fuels from our economy. And we can have a much healthier world by doing that, and much better for our children and grandchildren. So right now, if we make very significant changes, maybe I might say drastic changes, we can make the world a lot better instead of a lot worse. Now the way we cause climate change is that fossil fuel combustion releases greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and these retain heat on Earth that would otherwise be released to outer space. Probably you've all heard that, you're familiar with that idea, and I'll try to explain it a little bit more later. Well, I'm going to start with the mental health effects of climate change. I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, I'm a pathologist. So I'm taking this information from, you can see at the bottom of the slide, mental health and our changing climate. It's a report from the American Psychological Association. But one thing you might do, and that I would advise if you really want to understand climate change, is to read this novel, Never Let Me Go, by Ishiguro. And I think that this novel takes us to the the true heart of darkness of climate change. This is a science fiction novel, and I'm not going to tell you the story, but I believe, my interpretation is that this is a novel about climate change. It doesn't openly say that in the book, but it's only my opinion, and you might read it and think I'm mistaken. But anyway, for what it's worth, I think if you could only read one thing about climate change, I would read Never Let Me Go. Okay, so younger people are subject to serious mental health problems that are related to climate change. And younger people suffer more than older people like me because it's their life that's being harmed. And according to the American Psychological Association, younger people feel fear. Well, I feel fear, and I'm not young, but I feel plenty of fear, anger and despair and betrayal. Now this is a slide that I took off the internet. I don't know who took the picture, but this is from a student climate strike in Dublin in 2018. And I like the sign. It illustrates the concept of anger and betrayal that people feel because of their futures being tossed away by climate change. Okay, so then now we're going to talk about mainly the physical health effects of climate change for a bit. And I want to start with a study by the American College of Physicians. The American College of Physicians is an organization that is in charge of certifying doctors to be internal medicine specialists. So all the internal medicine specialists in the United States have to be approved by the American College of Physicians. And in 2016, they put together their own committee to study health and climate change. And they issued a report which was from a medical journal called Annals of Internal Medicine. You probably haven't heard of that, but among physicians, it's a very famous journal. Just like if you talked to me about a computer journal, I wouldn't know what you were talking about. So they predicted, I know you can read the slide without me reading it, so I won't do that, but what I wanted to emphasize was that they predicted that climate change would cause food insecurity, and they thought that would be one of the main problems that climate change would cause for us. And they predicted that the two biggest bread baskets in the world, which are the United States, Midwest, where we all live, and the Ukraine, would be devastated by climate change and would cause a decline in production of grains. And I think this is interesting in light of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. Is it possible that Vladimir Putin read the report or is aware of this, and he said, well, I should really get my hands on the grain in the Ukraine? I don't know. That's pure speculation. So I also want to point out waterborne diseases. The reason that climate change increases waterborne diseases is because there will be more floods. And in fact, Wisconsin and the northern part of the Midwest and also the Northeast, the New England states, are going to be the victims of more flooding. And when you have flooding, then you have contamination of our water sources by sewage and by manure and by other chemicals, so that we lose fresh water. And you don't hear about it on the news, but every time there's a big flood, people get sick from diarrheal and gastrointestinal illnesses. So floods cause more waterborne diseases. Now, vector-borne diseases, that means diseases that are carried by insects and ticks. And these increase because the insects and ticks are moving towards the poles as it gets warmer. And I'll talk more about that later, but I just wanted you to understand. So that report is from the American College of Physicians. The next report I wanted to talk about is from a group called the U.S. Intelligence Community. And the U.S. Intelligence Community consists of the FBI and the CIA and the National Security Agency. And at that time, this was in 2018, this is the most recent report that's available. And this is a public report. You can look it up online. And I think the reference is in my handout. Anyway, this one was written by Daniel Coates, who used to be the director, but no longer is the director. And you can see what he predicted, a warming world, water and food shortages, and I know you can read the slide. Now, I wanted to mention forced population migration, and what this means is that when the climate becomes so severely harmed, sometimes people are forced to move away and seek a new home. And an example of this that we're familiar with is that New Orleans is going to have to be evacuated, and already many people have moved away from there. And probably in the future, Miami will have to be evacuated. But the places that are going to really be hit the hardest are the Middle East, from Bangladesh to Israel. It's going to become too hot for people to live there. And I'll talk about this more later, but anyway, people will be forced to migrate away from places where they live because of the severity of climate change. Larger wildfires, everybody already knows about that. It's in the news every day. I'll talk about ocean acidification. Let me just mention it briefly now. Carbon dioxide is the main greenhouse gas that we release from industrial processes. And that carbon dioxide dissolves into the ocean partly. Carbon dioxide is soluble, slightly soluble in water. And when it goes into water, it reacts to form carbonic acid. Now, if you just look in your mind, think you have CO2 and you have H2O, if you add them together, you get H2CO3, that's carbonic acid. And so when we release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, some of it, a fraction of it, goes into the ocean, roughly a fourth, and it makes the ocean more acidic. So a side effect of warming that's not related to warming itself is ocean acidification. Okay. All right. Now, here is another report. This is from the United States Army. The U.S. Army War College issued a report in 2019 about climate change. And again, all these references I talk about are on the handout, so that's why the handout is good. And I wanted to point out that the Army is worried about geopolitical instability. And what they say is that there's not going to be enough fresh water for everybody if the amount of fresh water declines from floods and drought and other climate problems. Well, in that case, they are concerned that there will be disputes between countries or between large groups over fresh water. And the example they give is that China and Pakistan and India all depend on water that melts out of the Himalayan mountains. And so if one of those three was to claim that water belongs to them and not to one of the others, then that would be the kind of geopolitical instability that the U.S. Army is concerned about. Another concern that the Army raises is that when the Arctic ice melts, which is estimated to be about 2040, by about 2040, the Earth will be warm enough that the Arctic Ocean will no longer have ice in the summer. It'll still have ice in the winter when it gets cold, but then it'll completely thaw the summer. And the Army said, well, we have no plans at the present time for defending the United States from either China or Russia, should they send a fleet into the Arctic Ocean. So it would give us a new front, you might say, to defend. Also, relating to soldiers, the Army said that their policy of giving water to soldiers during combat is inadequate. It would not work under the new hot conditions that they might have to face, and they have to create a new policy for moving water. Another thing they're concerned about is tropical diseases. They expect to increase among soldiers. Let's see. Oh, and they also mentioned that, and I think everybody knows this, that we have sort of an aging power grid, and that as it becomes hotter in the summer, there may be more power blackouts because we can't meet the demand. Okay, so this is my own personal list of the problems caused by climate change, the health problems. And a lot of these I already talked about, but I was going to mention extreme heat. When a person is out in extreme heat, they can develop what's called heat stroke. The medical term is called hyperthermia, and that means that you lose the temperature regulation of your body. And it's like if you had a fever, and these people are usually about 104 degrees, you have a fever, but you don't have an infection. You have an incorrect thermostat, you might say, in your body. And when a person is subjected to really hot temperatures, say 100 degrees for several hours without relief, that's when they may get hyperthermia. Okay. There's also a new disease. It's called kidney disease, chronic kidney disease of unknown etiology. That means the cause isn't known, but it's closely related to heat. And it was only discovered in the 1980s, and it's people who work in tropical countries outside for long hours in the heat. After about 2 years, they develop kidney failure, and it's because, it appears to be because they are in so much heat that they become dehydrated every day. These are usually people who are poor and they have bad working conditions. They can't drink all the water that maybe they would like to, and they work long hours. So far, this has not occurred in the United States. It's occurred in Central America and in India and Sri Lanka and Egypt, all really hot countries, but it's called chronic kidney disease of unknown etiology. I should mention more powerful hurricanes. A hurricane takes heat that is in the water and it converts it into wind energy. In a sense, this is a hurricane is like an engine that uses heat to do work, and the work that it does is wind. Okay, so if we make the ocean hotter, then on average the hurricanes will become more powerful. There might not be more hurricanes, and I'm not saying that there will be more hurricanes, but the ones that occur on average will be more powerful. And actually, in the last few years, the number of Category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes has increased. More powerful hurricanes is another health problem. I think probably everybody knows about rising sea levels. If you warm water, then the volume of the water increases very slightly. Like if you warm water in a glass, you can't see that the volume increased. It's a tiny amount. But if you warm the whole ocean, where the volume of water is immense, then you have rising sea level. Also, if you melt a glacier and the glacier is located on land, and the water runs into the ocean, then you have rising sea level. So right now, about half of the sea level rise that's occurred is due to thermal expansion of water, and about half is due to the melting of glaciers on land. If you melt a glacier on the ocean, it's already on the ocean, then it doesn't change the height of the water. Okay, so what I was going to do now, before I go on, is to stop and see if there are any questions or comments or anything that anybody would like to say about these health things or these reports that I've gone over. Okay, well, the next thing I'll do is I'll show you a few examples, a few health examples. And the first one comes from the U.S. Army Medical Service, not U.S. Army, the U.S. Military Medical Service. The military has a combined medical service so that regardless of what branch you're in the same health system. It's a single health system. And they collect data on all sorts of things. And a newspaper, an online newspaper, it's called Inside Climate News, asked permission to look at their data on heat stroke in the military. So the military didn't make this graph. The Inside Climate News made the graphs, but they took the numbers. They got permission from the military to take the numbers and make them into a graph. And I think you can see that in the Navy and the Air Force, the incidence of heat stroke has not really changed. And this incidence, it's rate per 1,000. So on the y-axis, it's the number of people who have heat stroke out of 1,000, okay? But you can see that in the Army and the Marine Corps, roughly speaking, the number of cases of heat stroke has doubled over the 10-year period of the data collection. Now this was not, they didn't study, they just took all the cases, okay? So these are just all the cases in the entire US military system. So they didn't like say, are they in a hot place or a cool place, stuff like that. All they did was take the raw data and put it on a graph. So anyway, this is the evidence that heat stroke is becoming a bigger problem in the armed forces. Now, this is a study from Canada, and it came out in a medical journal called Trends in Parasitology. I'm sure you never heard of it. It's kind of an obscure journal, but it was published by a laboratory from Canada that does all the testing for Lyme disease in the entire country of Canada. Canada is different from the US because they have a national health care system, and so everybody, you might say in a sense, everybody has the same doctor and everybody has the same laboratory. So this laboratory did all the testing for Lyme disease from all Canadians in the entire country. So this is a unique study. Like you couldn't do it in the US because you'd have so many different laboratories. You know, you'd have to say, oh, did I forget this one or did I include that one? But these guys could include all of Canada. And you can see that, oh, I should say, if you don't know it, Lyme disease is an infection. It's caused by a bacteria called Borrelia. That's the genus name of the bacteria. And you get it from a tick bite. So a tick who has the infection but doesn't get sick, the bacteria doesn't bother the tick, bites a human, and then the human gets the infection. Okay, and I'm sure you've all heard of Lyme disease, isn't that true? Okay, so you can see that in Canada, there's been a huge increase in the number of cases of Lyme disease between 2002 and 2015, and this is because Canada got warmer. And what happened was the ticks that carry Lyme disease in the US, they're called Ixodes, I-X-O-D-E-S. These ticks could not live in Canada until about 2002 because it was too cold. They would freeze in the winter. And there's a mouse. What happens is a mouse also carries the bacteria. A tick bites the mouse and becomes infected, and then the tick bites a human and passes the infection to the human. Okay, and the mouse, which is called the white-footed mouse, its scientific name, let's see what it is. I know I have it, but I forget it. Oh, it's Paromyscus leucopus, the white-footed mouse. It also migrated into Canada as Canada got warmer. Before the year 2000, the mouse didn't live in Canada, and now it does. So both the tick and the mouse migrated to Canada and took Borrelia with them, and now Lyme disease is a disease of Canadians as well as Americans. Okay. Now, these are just some examples of infectious diseases that either are increasing in numbers because of climate change or are expected to increase. Malaria is, everybody knows it's carried by a mosquito. The mosquito is called Anopheles, and Anopheles is migrating towards both of the poles as it gets warmer, and it's also going higher up mountains. And so in Africa, they had efforts to reduce malaria that failed because the Anopheles mosquito was able to migrate to higher areas of Africa that were formerly too cold for malaria. Dengue fever is a tropical disease carried by a different mosquito that's called the Aedes mosquito. And the last time there was a study published in the Lancet also in 2016, and they had data going all the way back to 1950. And going from 1950 to 2016, the most cases of dengue fever occurred in 2016. 2016 was the best year for dengue fever in the history of the world, as far as we know. And it's because the Aedes mosquito is moving north and moving south away from the equator and towards the poles and carrying the virus that causes dengue with it. This last summer, the state of Vermont reported Aedes mosquitoes in Vermont. That had never happened before, but the health department of the state of Vermont monitors animals that carry diseases, and they discovered Aedes mosquitoes in Vermont for the first time. I do have this list of floods. These are the microorganisms that cause gastrointestinal disorders during a flood in the United States. They're the most common cause of flood-related gastrointestinal disease. Probably you've heard of some of them. Giardia is a more common one. E. coli, Salmonella, Campylobacter. You've probably heard of some of those. And norovirus is the virus that causes all the illness on cruise ships, but it also causes gastroenteritis during floods. Okay, now the next thing I wanted to talk about is called a toxic bloom. And a toxic bloom is a threat to fresh water. Toxic blooms have been occurring in Lake Erie in the last few years. And I think 2 years ago, I'm not sure if it was 2 or 3 years ago, the city of Cleveland had to stop taking water out of Lake Erie temporarily because of a toxic bloom. And what happens, a toxic bloom has two causes. One cause is that the water is unusually warm, and you can see that's the one related to climate change. The other cause is that nutrients get dumped into the fresh water, and this usually comes from, these are nutrients from manure or from fertilizer, and the nutrients are phosphorus and nitrogen. And what happens is that microorganisms grow extremely fast in warm water that's filled with nutrients, and they grow so fast that they deplete all the oxygen. Probably you know this, but bacteria are comfortable without oxygen. They can continue to live, whereas most of the fish and plants in a lake cannot. So what they do is they kill everything in the lake, all the living things, and they also make the water unfit to drink. Now this picture comes from a beach in Florida, and in Florida, when they have toxic blooms, but they call them red tides. And if you ever care to do a search under red tide, and you'll come up with toxic blooms that occur in the ocean in Florida. And this is because the government of Florida is very casual about dumping things into the ocean. And so when the ocean water becomes quite warm, they get toxic blooms along the Florida beaches. So toxic blooms are a threat to freshwater sources. Okay, now here's a graph of sea level rise. This goes all the way back to the year 0, and I think you can see that in the past there was virtually no change in sea level in the world until the 20th century, and then the sea level started to rise, and of course it's going to rise quite a bit more than that in this century. And that's because of thermal expansion of water and melting of ice on land. Okay. I wanted to show this to show you the idea that everybody in the US is affected by climate change. You might not feel it every day, but I'm using this as an example. This is a weather map from September 15, 2020. And that you might remember, and that was a time when there were lots of forest fires in California and Oregon and Washington. And the brown color shows the smog or the smoke particles moving across the United States from the forest fires. And then you can also see that there are 2 hurricanes. One is located pretty close to New England, and the other one is located pretty close to Florida and Alabama. And so you could see from this map that just about the whole United States was engulfed in some aspect of climate change on that day. And of course it's going to get progressively worse unless we take action. This is a study that comes from the Environmental Protection Agency, and it's a listing of the pollutants that come from burning fossil fuels. And the top line shows the amount of carbon dioxide released from fossil fuel combustion. Now, there's really 3 kinds of fossil fuels: coal, oil, and gasoline is under oil. Gasoline is a derivative of oil, and natural gas. And this is expressed as pounds of carbon dioxide per billion BTU of energy. Well, a BTU is called a British thermal unit. It's a measure of energy that's used by engineers. I'm not an engineer and I'm not very familiar with it, but the one probably you learned in college was the joule. You've probably heard of joules. Well, a BTU is roughly equal to 1,000 joules. When we burn fossil fuels, we release. You can see on the top row, we release carbon dioxide, and coal is the worst. Oil and gasoline are intermediate, and natural gas is the best. But actually, we can't afford any of these. We can't afford to burn any of these fossil fuels and keep increasing the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Another thing I wanted to point out is if you go down to the second line from the bottom, it's called particulates. And when we burn fossil fuels, we release soot or smog into the air. And some of these particles are extremely tiny, and they're inhaled into the lung, and then they're distributed into other parts of the body. And recent studies in my own field of pathology have demonstrated that you can find tiny soot particles in human brains and in the heart and in the placenta. It's been known for many years that air pollution is harmful to people, but it's never always been that clear exactly how it does harm. And so this is a new discovery, and it's a new idea that maybe when these particles come inside of our body, that they are the cause of the problems that we have with air pollution. Like air pollution makes heart attacks statistically more common. And now we know from recent discovery that particles from air pollution are deposited in the heart. And air pollution is associated with premature birth and with other problems at birth. And now we know that the placenta has tiny particles of air pollution. Just this past summer, in July, there was an article from a British group of researchers saying that there was an association, a statistical association, between dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and air pollution. So that the more air pollution a person was exposed to, the higher their risk of eventually developing Alzheimer's disease. And now we know more recently that the brain actually contains particles from air pollution. And I'm going to just show you one slide. Now, maybe those of you farther back aren't going to be able to see this, but this is a microscopic slide from a placenta. And these green structures are the placental villi, and they're very irregularly shaped. The placental villi grow into the uterus of the mother, and they are what provides air to the baby. Okay, so what happens is the placental villus has a blood vessel, and that blood vessel gets very close to blood vessels in the mother's uterus, and then oxygen is transferred from the mother's blood vessel to the baby, to the placental blood vessel, and that's how babies get oxygen. So this is a microscopic slide, and the green part, is the placental villi of the mother. Now you could probably see that there are little white arrows on different parts of the slide. Are you able to see that from where you are? And next to those white arrows, there's a little tiny dot. And what that is it's a dot of smog or of air pollution. And the way it's detected is you have this green light that is going through the microscope to show you the placenta villi. But then they took a laser that is at a 90-degree angle to the tissue, and it's shooting through the tissue. And when there's a solid particle, a solid particle that's very harder than tissue, that then the laser is deflected and it looks like a white spot. Okay, so even though we would call the smog black, if we could see it, it would be like a brown or black color. It looks white in this preparation because it's bouncing a laser off of it. Okay. Another thing, I don't want to go into too much detail, but a way you can confirm this is that these products of air pollution contain iron. You've probably heard, or maybe you've heard, that one of the things of air pollution is heavy metals. So air pollution sometimes contains mercury and cadmium and lead and arsenic, but actually the most common metal that it contains is iron. So there's a scientist in England developed a very, very sensitive way of measuring magnetism, and she can detect iron in these slides. She can confirm that there's iron in those particles by detecting the magnetism of the iron. Okay, so all of us are, in a sense, victims of air pollution. The World Health Organization says that 4 million people each year die from air pollution. And the reason they die is because they have lung disease that gets worse, like asthma and chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And also they get cancers, like lung cancer is associated with air pollution. And they have a higher risk of heart attack and stroke. And doing statistical modeling, the World Health Organization says that about 4 million people die early deaths each year from air pollution. Most of these people are in China and India, where the air pollution is a lot worse than it is here. Okay, now this is a study from the journal Science. I'm sure you've all heard of the journal Science. It's one of the most well-known science journals, and this reference is also listed in the handout. And what they did was they wanted to do the statistical risk of people born in different years. Okay, so in this graph, they're looking at people born in 1960, and if you're born in 1960, how many heat waves are you going to experience in your life? And they came up roughly with the number 4. Now this is for the whole world, so it's an average over the whole world, okay? Now, say instead you were born in 2020. What is your risk of a heat wave? Well, this one that says times 7, this is if the world does nothing about climate change and we continue on as we are, then the person born in 2020 will experience 7 times more heat waves than the person born in 1960, okay? Now the times 6, this is if we keep warming to 2 degrees centigrade. So if we stop at 2 degrees centigrade, then it's 6-fold increase in heat waves. And if we stop at 1.5 degrees centigrade, I don't know what, maybe they're telling me I need to shut up. If we stop at 1.5 degrees centigrade, which is recommended by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, then it's a 4-fold increase in the number of heat waves. Okay, well, let me stop here again and just see it. Does anybody have any questions or comments that they wish to make?
I'm sure the insurance companies would like that data on hurricanes and as policies arise and more flooding.
Yeah, yes, actually there are several insurance companies that are working on this. And I'm sorry, I'm not a business person, but there's a company that has done a whole bunch of work on insurance and climate change. And also there's another company, the name is called Jupiter. It's jupiter.com, I believe. And what they do is they do risk assessment of property for sea level rise. And you can hire them and like just say if you're in Charleston, South Carolina, you can hire them and say, I'm thinking of buying a building in Charleston. What is my risk of flooding? And they will tell you, they will calculate the sea level rise in the future and give you an estimate of the risk. Okay, any other comments or questions? I'm just going to go to my last slide here. This is a slide from Oxfam. Oxfam, gives food to poor people, and in the course of giving food to poor people, they study what's happening in the world so that they can anticipate problems. And this is a study that they did showing weather-related disasters compared to civil conflict. And you can see that this is before the Ukraine war, so it's dated by that. But you can see that the green line is civil conflict. There's been a small increase in, this is measuring how many people are displaced by a disaster. So the green line is how many people are displaced by war, and the blue line is how many people are displaced by a climate disaster. And you can see that there's been a big increase in the number of displaced persons due to climate disasters. And they translated this into a statistic that I find helpful. They said in 1980, the number of days between billion-dollar weather disasters was 80. But in 2016, the number of days between billion-dollar weather disasters is 18. So it's a big change, and that's climate change. So that's everything that I wanted to say. Thank you very much for listening, and if there are any further questions or comments.
Is there any hope?
Yes, we have to reduce use of fossil fuels. That's what we have to do. In fact, let me just, I do have here, this is what you can do. I have a list. Is there anybody who didn't get my card? I have a card that lists websites that give really good scientific information about climate change. If you didn't get one, come up here after the talk and I'll give you one. Okay, well, let's quit then. Thank you. Thanks very much.